Mr. President, in recent days I've spoken several times on the matter of tax expenditures. I'm going to address this subject again today, and it is a timely topic. Everyone is talking about our out-of-control deficits and debt. There are divergent opinions on how best to deal with our nation's increasingly perilous fiscal situation. But there's one thing that everyone seems to agree on. Both the deficits and the debt are unsustainable. If we keep going down this fiscal path, the U.S. will face a crisis similar to that in Greece, and sooner rather than later. The numbers cannot be clearer. Federal spending as a share of our economy is trending at a pace 15 to 20% greater than its historical average of 20.6% of GDP. If we leave in place this year's level of taxation, including the marginal rate relief of the 2001 and 2003 tax cuts, and patch the alternative minimum tax, or AMT, the federal tax take will equal or exceed its historic share of the economy. Now, liberals suggest that the deficit and debt can only be resolved with a significant tax increase. This is either deliberately misleading or sadly delusional. They are either selling snake oil to the American people or they refuse to come to grips with reality. But sticking their heads in the sand is not an option here. As you can see, federal taxes and spending as a percentage of GDP, the red line happens to be the spending line. And as you can see, we're way up here in the Obama 2012 budget. The blue line happens to be the average between 1960 and 2009. And as you can see, it's way down here. Our spending is out of control. The markets and the American people understand the nature of our crisis. Non-defense discretionary spending is at historic levels, and our entitlement programs are headed for bankruptcy. When former Speaker of the House Nancy Pelosi responded to the utter failure of President Obama and congressional Democrats to come up with a Medicare reform plan, she responded, quote, "We have a plan, it's called Medicare," unquote. That attitude is a recipe for bankrupting the nation. A bankruptcy that will take our seniors down with it. The left might prefer to ignore reality, but here's the undeniable truth. Our nation faces a spending crisis that tax increases cannot fix. And I wish that the media would get this. They are so enamored with the idea of a grand bargain on deficit reduction, a little spending reduction here, a little tax increase there, that they miss a fundamental point. The problem is spending, as you can easily see by this red line. It's way out of whack. And going back to the dry well of raising taxes on the rich is not going to work. The fact that Democrats in the Senate have not put forward a budget in over 800 days is neglecting one of the core constitutional responsibilities, and it's all the evidence we need that they are afraid of the bill coming due on all of their spending. They understand that their hard-left base will not accept structural changes to our biggest spending programs under any circumstances. But they also understand that the American people will not stomach for a minute the tax increases that will be necessary in the absence of such reforms. This is a difficult position to be in, so rather than deal with the facts, they traffic in obfuscation. This morning I heard the ranking Democratic member on the House Budget Committee following the President's lead and suggesting that removing some tax breaks for energy companies would fix our deficit crisis. Getting rid of those tax breaks would raise $21 billion over the next 10 years. Yet this fiscal year alone, in 2011, we will have a projected budget deficit of about $1.5 to $1.6 trillion. So where's the rest of the money going to come from? Last week I came under fire for stating what I thought to be a relatively non-controversial fact. Here's what I said. In 2009, 51% of Americans had zero or negative income tax liability. Now here's what that means. In 2009, only 49%, a minority of all households in this country, 49% of tax units shouldered 100% of the nation's tax burden. And 51% of the tax units, a majority of all tax units in this country, either owed nothing to the IRS or better yet got money back from the IRS in excess of their tax liability. 23 million of them got refundable tax credits, much more than they pay in in employment taxes, which are Social Security. And by the way, as they pay into Social Security, they're only paying a third of what they'll ultimately draw out, according to the actuaries. But they're not paying income taxes. Now, this should be no less controversial than saying the sun rises in the east. This is not conjecture. It is a demonstrable fact, yet it apparently touched a nerve, because last week, after raising this issue on the Senate floor, MSNBC and the liberal blogosphere, presumably armed with the talking points from the Senate Democratic War Room, went ballistic, suggesting that I wanted to balance the budget by raising taxes on the poor. I'm not surprised, but this completely misses my point. And the point is this: no matter what these Democrats tell you, the wealthy and middle class are already shouldering around 100% of the nation's tax burden, and 51% pay absolutely nothing in income taxes. Furthermore, because of this perverse distribution of federal income taxes, there is no way to fix our deficit hole and start paying down the debt by increasing taxes only on the so-called rich. Here's the bottom line. All of the left's talk about taxes on the rich and closing loopholes and going after corporate tax breaks is meant to divert attention away from the sad fact that the president's out-of-control spending puts Democrats in a position of having to raise taxes big time on the middle class if they are going to balance the budget without structural reforms to our largest spending programs. Tax increases on the wealthy will not get our nation to fiscal balance. Even if we let the Bush tax breaks expire for the top income bracket, the total amount raised over 10 years would be $615 billion. That's over 10 years. Yet our deficit this year alone is $1.5 to $1.6 trillion. And this is why the issue of tax expenditures is critical. Now, just so everybody knows, I made it pretty clear, I thought, in my last remarks, that I don't want to tax the truly poor, those who would help themselves if they could. I don't want to tax them. But you can't tell me that 51% of all households are the truly poor. And I really don't want to tax them either, to be honest with you. But it's apparent that we're going to have to find a better way of broadening the base of the tax system. Now, Democrats talk about tax expenditures as though they were the holy grail of deficit reduction. Just close these loopholes and happy days are here again. Now, the public is being misled in this type of debate, but don't take my word for it. Today, the Associated Press had a story with the following line: spin meter. Obama, Dems, skirt issue on tax hikes. And this is what the body of the article has to say. Quote, proposals under consideration include raising taxes on small business owners and potentially low and middle income families. You won't hear about that from Obama. Instead, the president focuses on the very rich and speaks euphemistically. Here are a few of the phrases the president has used of late to talk about what amounts to raising taxes for some. What we need to do is to have a balanced approach where everything is on the table. He goes on to say we need to take on spending in the tax code. The tax cuts I'm proposing we get rid of are tax breaks for millionaires and billionaires, tax breaks for oil companies and hedge fund managers and corporate jet owners. You can't reduce the deficit to the levels that it needs to be reduced without having some revenue in the mix, unquote. All of those are quotes by the president. They're doing their best to hide their intentions, but the writing is on the wall. Democrats are angling for historic tax increases on the middle class, and the way that they would like to accomplish this is by reducing or eliminating tax expenditures. Now, cutting back tax expenditures is a convenient way for Democrats to tax middle-class tax-paying families without having to say they are raising their tax rates. As I noted last week, this is what we were talking about when Democrats discuss tax expenditures. They are talking about your pension. They are talking about your Medicare. They're talking about your ability to purchase a home or save for retirement or give to your church or put away money for your children's education. This is exactly what we are talking about. That is where the money is. It is not in bonus depreciation for corporate jets, and it is not in tax benefits for energy companies. When Democrats talk about tax expenditures and tax loopholes as a way to bring down the deficit and debt, they are putting a bullseye on the backs of middle-class American families. We heard a lot this morning about Republicans walking away from the president's grand bargain on deficit reduction. Well, I know that the people of Utah applaud Speaker Boehner for not signing on to this bogus deal. This morning, the president's allies in the media were out asking why Republicans walked away from this deal. With the president willing to put entitlement spending on the table, why aren't Republicans willing to put taxes on the table? First, it is worth noting that the president and his Democratic allies steadfastly refuse any structural changes to entitlement spending. And second, for Democrats, putting taxes on the table and tax expenditures means tax increases on the middle class. And that is a non-starter. This issue of tax expenditures is confusing and demands greater clarity. As ranking member of the Finance Committee, it is my responsibility to correct the record on what the curtailment or elimination of tax expenditures would really mean for taxpayers and families. If you listen to my friends on the other side of the aisle, you would think tax expenditures are, quote, spending through the tax code, unquote. You would think they are mostly loopholes in the tax law designed by and for special interests like ethanol blenders. Another mantra you will hear too often uncritically reviewed by many in the media is that tax expenditures disproportionately benefit wealthy taxpayers. A few days ago, I talked about what tax expenditures are and what tax expenditures are not. They are not spending. You can find the text of that speech from July 6th on the Finance Committee website. And they are not, in the main, loopholes for special interests. Just the other day, I talked about the major features of family financial planning that would be upended if tax expenditures were curtailed. I referred to employee pension plans like 401k accounts. I also mentioned charitable gifts and home ownership interest deduction. If my friends on the other side are successful in cutting back tax expenditures, American families, workers, and investors can expect the cost of all these activities to rise. If the cost rises as a nation, we will be poorer because we will have less retirement savings, fewer charitable contributions, and more expensive home ownership. You can find the text of that speech from last Thursday on the committee website as well. Today I'm going to consider the oft-repeated line that tax expenditures disproportionately benefit the wealthy taxpayers. For purposes of this discussion only, I'll adopt the president's definition of rich. That is, singles with adjusted gross incomes over $200,000 per year and married couples with incomes over $250,000 per year. I want to be clear that I do not lump all of these folks into Bill Gates Jr., LeBron James, Warren Buffett, or Gilligan's Island's resident millionaire, Thurston Howell III. Now here's Thurston, good old Thurston. He was the millionaire in Gilligan's Island. I'm using the president's definition of rich because most of my friends on the other side use it. They also claim tax expenditures reside disproportionately with rich taxpayers. The Democrats' rhetoric on expenditures does not jibe with the reality of our tax code. The data is clear. Tax expenditures tend to skew towards taxpayers below the president's definition of the rich. If my friends on the other side examine the data, they will find that their assertion about who benefits from tax expenditures does not square with the facts. They will find that their assertion that tax expenditures disproportionately benefit the wealthy falls flat on its face. In much of the coverage of tax expenditures, it has been taken as an article of faith that they disproportionately benefit wealthy taxpayers. Similar assertions have come from the White House and congressional Democrats. The one exception is my friend, the ranking Democrat on the Ways and Means Committee, Senator Levin. Congressman Levin has cautioned against treating tax expenditures as rich persons' tax benefits, and his position is well-founded. The source for this assertion that tax expenditures are tax benefits to the rich is a Tax Notes article dated May 3rd, 2011. I ask unanimous consent to insert it in the record at this point.
Without objection.
Now, the article is written by Roberton Williams of the Tax Policy Center, or TPC. TPC is a tax policy think tank that is the product of two center-left think tanks. The article presents conclusions from a TPC distribution analysis of tax expenditures. The analysis concludes that about 2/3 of tax expenditures benefit the top quintile of households in the study. Viewers on C-SPAN may wonder what a quintile is. It refers to a fifth of a given population. The TPC analysis is therefore measuring the top fifth of the population. According to that study, where does the top fifth of the population begin? It begins at $123,000 of household income. It should be noted that household income is a bit broader than the adjusted gross income, which is the basis of the President's definition. According to TPC, that top quintile earns 55% of income and shoulders a huge amount of the federal tax burden. They say it is 67%. Now, perhaps not too surprisingly, TPC finds that tax expenditures for the top quintile approximate that top fifth's share of the tax burden. With the exception of the refundable credit tax expenditures, a taxpayer has to pay income tax to benefit from a tax deduction, credit, or exclusion. Those asserting that tax expenditures are mainly wealthy taxpayer benefits are principally relying on TPC's distribution analysis. If confronted with the TPC data, it seems to me they have four choices. Their first choice would be to revise downward the income basis of their definition of rich. They could say we really did not mean families at $250,000 of income. We meant families of $123,000 of income. That would be similar to the adjustment made for Obamacare. Joint tax distribution tables for Obamacare showed that for every family below $200,000 that received an exchange credit, 4 families paid higher taxes. For every middle-class family that receives a premium subsidy, 5 pay higher taxes. That's just a fact. I guess I said 5, it really would be 4 would pay higher taxes. A second choice would be to revise the proportion of tax expenditures so that the tax expenditure dollar amount reflects the benefits attributable to taxpayers defined by the President as rich. The President's rich taxpayer definition is the top 3 to 5% of taxpayers. It means the group of taxpayers is roughly 25 to 33% of the size of the group in the TPC analysis. Put another way, the TPC population of, quote, rich, unquote, taxpayers is 3 to 4 times the size of the group the President and my friends on the other side define as rich. If a consistent definition of the rich were used, the dollar amounts of tax expenditures in play would be considerably lower. Since the goal of the group pushing the cutback of tax expenditures is to relieve spending constituencies of the pressure of curtailing spending, my guess is they will not choose to reduce the tax expenditure kitty. The third choice would be to simply curtail or eliminate tax expenditures for higher income taxpayers. This, of course, could largely eliminate the preferential rates for capital gains and dividends. Let's take another look at this because it shows a big share of the capital gain tax expenditure goes to the top fifth. Now, it looks like about 95% of tax expenditure accrues in the top fifth. Well, you'll see that about 50% of it accrues to the top 1/10 of 1%. Do we think it would make sense in the current economic climate to double or triple the tax hit on investment? At one point, at least the President's answer was no. In August 2009, the President was asked by a resident of Indiana, quote, explain how raising taxes on anyone during a deep recession is going to help with the economy, unquote. Here was the President's response, quote, normally you don't raise taxes in a recession, which is why we haven't and why we've instead cut taxes. You don't raise taxes in a recession. We haven't raised taxes in a recession, unquote. So what is their fourth choice? Their fourth choice would be coming clean with the American people. Under this option, they would admit that tax expenditures disproportionately go to families who are not rich under the president's own definition. They would acknowledge that cutting back tax expenditures as part of a deficit reduction exercise would hit the middle class and betray the president's promise not to raise taxes on middle-class families. As you can see, the proponents of these tax increases are in political quicksand, and there is additional evidence that they are sinking as they struggle against the facts. I would ask my friends on the other side to take a look at the joint tax distribution tables on many of the major tax expenditure categories. Joint Tax publishes these tables every year. They are available on the Joint Tax website. Now, I have a chart that summarizes the percentages of tax expenditures that go to taxpayers under $200,000. I'll have to bring that with me the next time. That's the breakpoint that Joint Tax uses. The percentage of tax expenditures that go to taxpayers under $200,000. It closely squares with the definition of rich used by the president and his liberal allies. Anybody above $200,000 is rich under my Democratic friend's definition. Anybody under $200,000 is not rich. You can find this data in the tax expenditures pamphlet published annually by the nonpartisan Joint Tax staff. Now, we'd like to talk about the tax expenditures that Joint Tax distributes by income. I have listed them in order, from the largest in dollar volume down to the lowest in dollar volume. The first one is well known to tens of millions of our constituents. It is the mortgage interest deduction. If a taxpayer saves up a down payment and borrows for a home, they can take the interest paid on the mortgage as an itemized deduction. That means that 30% of the benefit of mortgage interest tax expenditure goes to taxpayers over $200,000. Taxpayers with income below $200,000 receive 70% of the benefit of the mortgage interest deduction. Now, how do we measure whether the mortgage interest deduction disproportionately benefits taxpayers over $200,000? Well, there is a line in the taxpayers' approach to this in bold letters, and it reads, quote, compare total federal tax burden. That is the baseline of how much tax is shouldered by the group of taxpayers above and below $200,000. Now, we have a very progressive tax system. Taxpayers earning more than $200,000 shoulder 64% of the tax burden. Taxpayers earning less than $200,000 shoulder 36% of the tax burden. Taxpayers earning less than $200,000 receive 70% of the mortgage interest deduction while shouldering 36% of the tax burden. Now, who benefits from these tax expenditures? We're going to get into that. That means by a ratio of almost 2 to 1, taxpayers under $200,000 benefit from the mortgage interest deduction. And since $200,000 basically fits the definition of rich used by my friends on the other side of the aisle, we can see that other taxpayers, the non-rich or middle-income group, disproportionately benefit from the mortgage interest deduction. Now, let me talk about another tax expenditure. I'm referring to the Earned Income Credit, or EIC. It is a refundable credit. That means taxpayers receive it whether they pay income tax or not. That is why the credit is basically scored as spending by the Congressional Budget Office, the CBO, and Joint Tax. There's a bit of irony about this tax expenditure. Because it's refundable, it is more popular with my friends on the other side than other tax expenditures. And that is because those other tax expenditures go to taxpayers who actually pay more tax, or actually pay income tax, excuse me. The refundable credit is popular with my friends on the other side because it is a robust income redistribution mechanism. President Obama, in his famous exchange with Joe the plumber, captured the economic theory supporting this policy when he said we need to, quote, spread the wealth around, unquote. Here's the irony. My friends on the other side derisively describe all tax expenditures as, quote, spending through the tax code, unquote. Yet the tax expenditures they most support are the refundable ones, like the Earned Income Credit. It should come as little surprise that the left's favorite tax expenditure is the one that is scored as spending by congressional scorekeepers. Because the Earned Income Credit tax expenditure is refundable, you shouldn't be surprised to find that so-called rich taxpayers do not benefit from it. The chart confirms this point. The third tax expenditure is the current 1,000 right here, the 1,000 per child tax credit. It is by definition limited to lower and middle income taxpayers. We should not be surprised to find that none of it goes to higher income taxpayers, and the chart confirms this point: 0 to taxpayers over 200,000, 100% to taxpayers under 200,000. Let's take a look at state and local taxes. It is the fourth one on here. The chart shows that 50% of the broad-based deduction goes to middle-income families. Number 5 on this list is a tax benefit near and dear to many of my fellow Utah families. It is the itemized deduction for charitable contributions or donations. Of all the tax expenditures listed on this chart, this big chart right here, this one, charitable itemized deductions, distributes in the highest proportion to taxpayers above $200,000 in income. The chart says 55% right here. 45% of those under $200,000. But keep in mind, overall taxpayers with income over $200,000 bear 64% of the tax burden. Now this means proportionally the charitable deduction benefits taxpayers under the $200,000 level more than taxpayers above the $200,000 level. Now let's take a look at number 6 on this chart. It is the tax-free portion of Social Security benefits right there. Anyone advocating a cutback on tax expenditures is advocating a cutback on the after-tax Social Security benefits for a big chunk of the senior population. And guess what? We're not talking about wealthy seniors. According to this chart, 2% of that favorable tax treatment of Social Security goes to seniors with incomes over $200,000. My guess is that few of the seniors benefited from this policy own yachts or regularly fly corporate jets. Number 7 is the itemized deduction for real property taxes. Right now, their constituents take the edge off that. Heavy local tax hit with the itemized deduction. If many of my friends on the other side have their way and hack away or eliminate tax expenditures without also cutting their constituents' federal tax rate, guess what happens? In the case of local property taxes, the net effect will be to raise the property tax by as much as 35%. Some of my friends may suggest that only those with villas are taking the property tax deduction. This chart says otherwise. It says 80% of real property tax benefits go to taxpayers under $200,000. Now, how about number 9 on the list? Number 9 on the list is the itemized deduction for medical expenses. Obamacare cut back on that one, but if my friends on the other side reduce or eliminate side tax expenditures to avoid dealing with out-of-control government spending, this deduction will be cut back even more. The chart shows on these medical itemized deductions that 89% of this tax benefit goes to taxpayers earning less than $200,000. Number 10 is the dependent child care credit. This is a modest tax credit that working moms and dads can tap. Like the child tax credit, it mainly is used by middle-income families. The chart confirms it. It indicates that 96% of the benefits of this credit go to families earning less than $200,000. Now, the final item on the list is the student loan interest deduction right here. This tax benefit is income limited. Not surprisingly, all of the benefit goes to taxpayers earning less than $200,000, 100% of the benefit. Now, I don't think a lot of the recent college graduates using this deduction are in the market for a yacht. But if you listen to my friends on the other side, you would think because this benefit is labeled a tax expenditure, those who benefit from it have a schooner docked in the local harbor. Now, Mr. President, I'm not saying that only middle-income families benefit from tax expenditures. Wealthy taxpayers benefit from lower capital gains and dividend rates. And let me refer to the 10 largest tax expenditures for the period from 2010 to 2014. But the lion's share of tax expenditures goes to that part of the middle class that is already shouldering much of the nation's tax burden. Most of the tax expenditures are either income limited or of limited value to wealthy taxpayers. Likewise, low-income families don't pay income taxes. They receive tax expenditures that are designed for the non-tax-paying population. So who's left? The answer is the taxpayers who are not rich by the president's own definition. The answer is middle-class families. On our side, the reaction to all these choices would be simple. Many on our side, including the Ways and Means Committee Chairman Camp, have put it this way: keep your hands off tax increases, including cutbacks in tax expenditures for deficit reduction. Reserve those tax expenditures for tax reform. In that way, the taxpayers receive a benefit, lower rates in exchange for a broader base. That broader base would include reform of tax expenditures if Chairman Camp and I have our ways. Any other approach is just another tax increase. And they'll just spend every dime of it on this other side. The president this morning gave another press conference. He asked what the holdup was in arriving at a deficit reduction compromise. The answer seems pretty obvious. Contrary to the president's vague assertions, the left-wing base that he is depending on for his reelection refuses any meaningful structural reforms to the spending programs that are currently bankrupting our country. That means that the only serious deficit reduction option available to Democrats is massive tax increases on the middle class. Democrats won't acknowledge the inevitable tax increases that their agenda assumes, and Republicans won't give the president any cover in his drive to, quote, spread the wealth around, unquote. That is what is holding up this process. Now, let me offer a suggestion. Instead of berating Republicans for not signing on to historic and economic crushing tax increases when unemployment is at 9.2%, maybe the president should take his own party to the woodshed. Maybe he should ask the liberals in his party who refuse any meaningful structural reforms to entitlements to get serious. Maybe he could go on television and explain to the American people that we have over $60 trillion in liabilities and the tax increases are not going to bring that into balance. Instead, the president and his party sit around and spread the myth that simply getting rid of tax expenditures and loopholes, and they certainly aren't loopholes, the ones I've been talking about, will fix our deficits and debt. We have two reasons to worry about that wrong-headed approach. One, to the extent deficit reduction energies are diverted to cutting back tax expenditures, pressure is taken off, the root cause of the deficit and debt problem. That is, pressure that should be brought to bear on out-of-control spending programs is released. Two, the productive sectors of the economy, workers, small business owners, and investors, are burdened with yet more federal taxes. For many reasons, cutbacks in tax expenditures are a deficit reduction dog that won't hunt. Now, if you look at all individual tax expenditures, you can see these are the 10 highest tax expenditures by percentage. But let me go back to the preceding chart. If you look at all these tax expenditures, mortgage interest itemized deduction, 70% of people under $200,000. Earned income tax credit, 100%. Child tax credit, 100%. State and local taxes other than real property, 50%. Charitable itemized deductions, 45%. Yeah, the rich have 55% by their definition. Social Security benefits, 98%. Real property tax itemized deduction, 80%. Education credit, 100%. Medical itemized deductions, 89%. Dependent child care credit, 96%. Student loan interest, 100%. Now, look, my point is we've got to come up with a better tax code. I am dedicated to changing this awful tax code that we have that is too complicated, too large, too expensive, doesn't do the job, and is just a bunch of muttering around and puttering around by members of Congress. And simplifying that code so everybody knows which end is up. On tax expenditures, I'm going to be happy to look at tax expenditures, but they should be reserved until we do real tax reform. And if you have to give up some of these expenditures, then there better be appropriate reductions to account for that. And we've got to do it by flattening out that tax system that we all know is just completely out of control and completely difficult to comply with. As a matter of fact, I don't know of anybody on the Senate Finance Committee who fills out their own tax reforms, or tax forms, rather. I think most of us could do it, because if you got 10 different tax preparers on a semi-complicated tax return, you'd probably have 10 different approaches to it. Now that shows a pathetic system that is wrecking our country. And just to make it clear, when the president took over, the bottom 40% of all households did not pay income taxes. Yes, they paid payroll taxes, but 23 million of them got refundable tax credits, much more than they paid in payroll taxes. Keep in mind, I don't believe we should tax the truly poor. But now that's up to 51% in just a little over 2 years under this administration of people who don't pay any income taxes. Are they all truly poor? I don't know. All I know is it doesn't sound right that the majority of people, the majority of tax units in this country, do not pay income taxes, and the minority has to carry the whole burden. Now, if they're truly poor, I understand, and I'd be the last one to tax them, and I think I have a 35-year record here of being fair to the poor and fair to families, and above all, fair to children. My name's on an awful lot of important bills around here, and I've led the fight on a lot of bills that help people in distress. So you can imagine how aggrieved I felt when one of our great television stations was distorting one sentence, seemed to me one sentence, out of a 30-minute set of remarks on the floor that made it very clear that I don't want to tax the truly poor. But surely we've got to have everybody participate, and I actually think everybody ought to participate, even if it's only $1. We ought to all have some skin in the game. We ought to all help save this country. And we can't do it without the middle class. And the middle class isn't just the top 49% of all wage earners. And this is an important issue. And it's one that we have to resolve, and we have to resolve it fairly. And we have to resolve it in a way that is meaningful, and in a way that will help save our country, too. And I think I've more than made the case that you can't just pile it all on the so-called 3 to 5% of the so-called rich, which includes 800,000 small businesses, where 70% of all jobs are created, and everybody knows that's true. And every time you tax them and take monies away from them like that, when they're paying pretty hefty taxes as it is, they hire less, they do less, they quit their businesses, some move offshore, some have moved their businesses to other countries, and some just plain give up. We can't let that happen. We've got to have a fair tax situation. We've got to have Democrats and Republicans work on it together. We've got to quit quit playing this card that basically pits one group of people against another. All I can say is this: I'm concerned. I'm pointing out difficulties in our tax code. I'm pointing out difficulties in some of the arguments the President is making. And I have to say that anybody who reads my remarks fairly will know that these points I'm making are real points. These charts really are important. And as you can see, taxpayers under $200,000 will be bereft without these benefits unless we can revamp the whole tax code in a way that you don't have to have tax expenditures. Tax expenditures are certainly not spending. And these ones we're talking about right here and now. So if you compare the total federal tax burden, those earning over $200,000 pay 64%, those under $200,000 pay 36%. All of that's important for us to understand. And Mr. President, I yield the floor.